And we have an army, okay, as a soldier and as a general, as a retired general. We have an army of digital soldiers. What we are now, what we call, I call them, because this was an insurgency, folks. This was run like an insurgency. This was irregular warfare at its finest.
Do you think there could be an element of him having been psyoped?
I mean, he sat down to break bread with Vladimir Putin.
Truth is going to come out. Donald Trump will continue to be the president of the United States for the next 4 years. There's no doubt in my mind.
The American republic that we have, this form of government that we have, which is a republic, it will only last as long as the people of this country allow it.
Anyhow, this is one of our top quality guns. And,
maybe I'll find somebody in Washington, D.C.
This one's Florida compliant.
Mr. Flynn should be brought back on active duty and given a trial for offenses that I believe he has committed.
General Flynn, do you believe in the peaceful transition of power in the United States of America?
Let's go.
Ashley Babbitt, 35-year-old white woman from Southern California, Air Force veteran, storms the Capitol with leave aside all the propaganda with violent intentions. She wrote about them, and you know, until Tucker Carlson was off the air, you could hear once a week that she was unarmed. No, that's her knife on the cover. That's the evidence photo. You can see it dated 1/6/21. She climbs up into a window leading a mob, and a broken window. They smash the window. She climbs up into it, and we see on the video that very day the two hands of the Capitol Hill police officer who shoots her, and then the hands of a black man. And she's a white woman. And as a student of American mythology, American history, I know right away what's going to happen with that story. And it happened within hours. First, they start saying, Ashley, she wasn't 35. She was in her 20s. Or maybe she was 16. She was just a little white girl. And they start shrinking her. She's like 125 pounds. And that's not going to work. She's 115. No, she's 110. They are making her into this model of white innocence. Now, those not familiar with the history of lynching don't realize that at the heart of lynching throughout American history has been this kind of sexualized panic. This idea that black men are coming for our possessive. You see white women as kind of property. And that's the story they began telling. What was interesting to me from having gone to Trump rallies for years and seeing the role of martyrdom in them.
What could Biden do very easily right now? He could say, the United States supports the immediate admission of Ukraine to NATO. Simple. Other countries have done it. Many countries have done it. So the United States supports the immediate admission of Ukraine to NATO. Forget all this, membership action program. No, that's for peacetime. Admit Ukraine the same way West Germany, a divided country, was admitted in 1956. The way that Turkey and Greece were admitted together, even though neither one of them really qualified at the time. Another. All restrictions on the use of weapons are lifted. It's up to the armed forces of Ukraine to decide how best to defend their country. Right? Simple. A simple decision. Third, the Russian Federation is a terrorist state. Or if the law currently says you have to call it a state sponsor of terrorism, fine, you do that. Okay? So again, a simple thing. Congress has already passed many measures to say do that. So stroke of a pen, he could do that. There you go. There's 3 quick things he could do that would make a massive difference because they would carry other countries along.
And another thing I would emphasize here, both for people of younger generation who don't remember the Soviet Union and even for those of us who do, is that it was the largest, most far-reaching, deepest penetrating, grandest scale social engineering experiment ever performed on mankind. We are still in some ways coming to terms with the sheer scale of the experiment and the sheer scale of the catastrophe. It was in many ways unprecedented. It was an attempt not just to remake a government and not even just to remake a society. It was an attempt to re-engineer human beings on a massive, massive scale.
What eventually took down the KKK was what will take down, what did you call them before? The organized crime syndicate about to take over our country?
Organized crime ring. I got that from Jim. We share each other's words all the time in our work.
Okay, so the KKK was America's first Christian nationalist mass movement, right? Also white supremacist, also anti-Semitic, also anti-Catholic, but it was absolutely, it sold itself as white Christian nationalist, as it was going to bring purity, protect children, do all these things. And of course, it was anything but, right? That was like the kind of the gateway drug to get you to the awfulness. But what ended up taking it down most immediately was the corruption of its top leaders, right? That they were an organized crime ring. They were liars. They were hypocrites. Their conduct was outrageous. And when it became exposed, they lost members, right? So I think that is one lesson, to go back and look at that movement and see how it collapsed of its own contradictions, and a lot of determined organizing from the people it had targeted, or from other people who were good people and stood in solidarity with the targets. But that collapsing of its own contradictions, overstepping, corruption, etc., was crucial. So I think that that's a good takeaway to realize we're going to have some wind in our sails very soon.
Sort of towards the end of December, Musk started posting about grooming gangs in the UK and accusing the Prime Minister Keir Starmer of being responsible for what Musk called the rape of Britain, and calling Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister who has dedicated her entire career to fighting men's violence against women and girls, a rape genocide apologist. And it's been incredibly shocking, just really, really horrible to see the weaponization of sexual abuse of girls by the far right in order to sort of push a kind of conspiracist disinformation agenda. And what's been really interesting for me to witness and to analyze is how Musk's interventions on this issue have been picked up by the wider far right. So the British far right activist Tommy Robinson has become really active again in talking about these grooming gangs, in trying to make false claims about Labour and left-wing complicity in grooming gangs. And we've also seen a real intervention from US far-right voices and influencers in this issue, which again is something that they don't seem to know very much about. It's something that they're really taking their cues off from Musk. And it's a really clear example of the sort of networked nature of them. They take these conspiracies, they take these tropes, and they share them across these international networks in order to foster discontent with democracy, in order to undermine trust in governments, in the rule of law, in the criminal justice system, and in order to push the far-right Great Replacement conspiracy.
You mentioned a Georgian oligarch who basically runs most of Georgia. And in my learning from you and others, I've learned that Moldova also had its oligarch who was doing the work of Russia, and his name happened to be Elon, also Elon Shore. In America, we have Elon Musk. I need a statement from you for our viewers about the goals of these oligarchs and how these are patterns. We have it in America. You talked about it in Georgia. I'm sure you've seen this in Ukraine. You have it in Moldova. Their job seems to be doing the work of the Kremlin in these countries to push them away from the democratic aspirations that these young people have, and toward the Russian capture.
Well, exactly, Heidi. You just basically nailed it. That's exactly what's going on. and it has been going on for a very long time, and that's what we call a mafia state. At the top of a mafia state, there is a major oligarch, and I think during our shows, I must have mentioned before the word Krisha, which means roof, which is protection. That is the notion that was very popular in the 90s, where there were bandits running pretty much everything in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet space after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And that means basically like a godfather, the closest would be. There's, this one major bandit on top, and everybody else is paying money, or not necessarily money, or they doing, you also can compare it to vassals, to medieval, going back to medieval times if your history.
I look around and I see billionaires funding Christian nationalists. I see billionaires funding information war. I see billionaires funding operations on the street to confuse people as to what's really going on. I have been trying to get across the point to people that I think we are engaged in a global class war. Do you agree or disagree with that point of view?
I'm thinking. I see where you're going, but I wouldn't call it a class war. It's worse than that. Like, we sort of know what to do. There's historical precedent for class war. This is, I'm not even sure there are words for this. It's like it's a hostile fascist takeover. So it's not just rich people. It's rich people who derive their power from millions of violent armed individuals who are willing to kill their fellow citizens over the kind of small differences of opinion that used to be normal in democracies.
Yeah.
Or differences of ethnicity or religion. Like, what happened in Rwanda 30 years ago, where you had the Hutus and Tutsis murdering each other en masse, basically as a result of propaganda through Radio des Mille Collines. That wasn't a class war so much as a civil war orchestrated by anti-democracy forces, some of whom were rich people, but others of whom were just people who hated democracy. They were warlords, essentially.
Yeah.
Maybe they wanted to be rich one day, but they may not have been rich at the time. There's something far more savage and ancient going on here than class war. And I think that's part of what makes it so scary, to me at least.
I think it's what Bannon called this muzzle velocity, where you kind of throw stuff at people every day more and more, so that people at some point just get tired and don't really realize, because you're always caught up in the next scandal or next issue that's coming up. And it's extremely bad this time because they had years to prepare, and they had the experience from the first term when there were still some checks and balances and still some somewhat decent people in the administration that were kind of slowing down Donald Trump and also among elected Republicans. So this time they made sure not to have any that would slow them down, and to only have loyalists there in the administration. So it's very scary because they have these billionaires who are helping them, and they have X, and they have TikTok, and they have all these platforms, and then they have some medias with Fox News and some owned by Bezos and so on. So overall, it's just much better organized than the first time. It's kind of like a redo of the first administration, but just with more loyalists, better organized, not so focused on the second election and so on. And yeah, it's very scary. And I've been thinking about how to deal with it, because people have different theories on whether we should actually take them seriously when they say things or not. And I think the best way is still to call them out every time they do something crazy. But I think we should try to really keep the big picture in people's heads as well. So we should try to kind of not only look at each scandal or each crazy thing that they say, but to kind of remind people constantly about the big picture of what's going on and how they're failing to do what they promised to do. And also, I think we should make fun of them and be better at mocking them in general, because that's a way to do it so that people remember and understand, because Republicans have been extremely good at mocking Democrats and making fun of them
Yeah.
and supporters. And I think it's really important to ridicule Elon Musk and Donald Trump, because that's something that people understand and remember.
Now, one thing about the political situation here, and in a certain way, our having 100 different parties kind of helps in this way, because you're going to
Wow.
have to get, well, think about it, right? In the United States, it was easy to co-opt because you have two
Yeah.
parties. And in the UK, all right, they've got to be careful because, right,
Yeah.
it's still two parties. In Europe in general, we have so many different parties that they would have to co-opt all of them, okay? And that's not easy to do. That's why, by the way, they try to co-opt the top of the leadership, okay? Anybody that they feel will be able to win an election. Now, the German election is coming up. We know that the CDU, okay, is doing very well. Merz will probably be forming the next government, but it's always going to be a coalition government. Okay, so this is something that in Europe sort of saves us, because we have so many different political expressions going from extreme right to extreme left that they would have to co-opt all of those people. Now, what they will do is probably choose the countries that are the weakest, okay, where they can enter and penetrate. This is the mega movement, right, that we're talking about. But just so that we understand what the kind of let's say the kind of politics that would that the mega movement would have to operate in, the kind of environment that they have to operate in, which won't be that easy, by the way. Okay, it won't be that easy.
When did it become okay in America to hand somebody like Leo $1.3 billion and say, go ahead and do whatever you want to destroy the world in which we have known, the country that we have known, the freedoms that we have known? I still don't understand why overturning Roe wasn't enough to mobilize everybody against the faction in America that made that happen. But clearly, we memory hold too much. But when was it okay? I understand the faith and the kind of extremist nature of this, but what happened?
I would
Okay.
argue it's always been okay. That going back to the writing of the Constitution, when they baked it, they put into it about the racist stuff about black people, 3/5 of a vote and all of that kind of stuff. And I basically, if you look around at what Doge is doing and Leo and it's all, every single bit of it goes back to what I call white trash supremacy. It's very, very much a matter of the white trash supremacy is losing its privilege, and they're throwing a temper tantrum now. And whether you were looking at the Civil War, or whether you were looking at Reconstruction or Jim Crow afterwards, all of this stuff is about returning to before the New Deal, back to Jim Crow America, when white people had certain privileges, and now they're trying to remove whatever stepping stones we gave to black people, to women, to minorities. They want those stepping stones gone, so that people like Hegseth, who is a drunkard idiot, and running the Pentagon now. I mean, he's the guy that's going to decide whether protesters get shot. They just
It's
removed
just
all the lawyers and also one other thing. It was 1.6 billion, not 1.3 billion. And you're right, it's no strings attached. It's all about going after the media. It's going after entertainment. Go after everything. They're trying to change the entire world back to Jim Crow and before.
It was such a decisive moment of the end of the affair that I felt like Europeans in particular, perhaps finally belatedly, and this of course started with Munich, were shaken into realizing they absolutely cannot trust Washington. This idea of America as, despite all our problems and our hypocrisy and our racism and our violence, and that it was still somehow, the world's deepest liberal democracy and the land of the free and the home of the brave, and that everything that Soviet communism was not, and will in the end be the rescuer and guarantor of freedom. I feel like perhaps the last vestiges of that, that this were yesterday finally were dissolving. I mean, the responses of all of these European leaders were so unequivocal, and many of them are often equivocal, but even the ones who are often equivocal were responding in an unequivocal way, that there was just such disgust and such a sense of betrayal. I mean, one of the things I've been telling my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, and not just Ukrainians, but other Europeans as well, since the election, is you cannot trust us. There's this kind of Freudian denial that, okay, but it couldn't really be that bad. But in the end, it's the United States. In the end, they couldn't actually go that far. In the end, we couldn't really switch sides. Your president couldn't really be working for Putin. I said, no, you absolutely cannot trust us. It has to be over. You have to take that in. These are not people you can work with, either rationally or cynically. They are volatile, they are narcissistic, they are moral nihilists, they cannot be trusted.
No, obviously I do. I do feel like if more people spoke up and if more people did something about it, then we could save ourselves. And that's why I get so upset when I see people caving in. And I said, even though I understand that they're doing it for what they think are good reasons, but I am concerned because I feel like if everybody pushed back at some point, we would have, what my sister likes to talk about, that moment where quantity becomes quality, where, enough people pushing back on something makes it a different kind of pushback. In this country, we have the wonderful example of the film High Noon, where it's if you can get enough people, if you can gather enough people together, then something happens. But if not, then sometimes you just have to act alone. And this is why I was so upset when I heard that the Marine Band was canceling those concerts with Equity Art, because I felt like everyone in the band I knew was so intent on having those concerts, and they were so interested in working with these young students. Every one of them, every professional musician in the world jumps at the chance to help young students grow. And that was a project that was canceled because the leadership of the Marine Band thought, well, there's a new executive order and we're not supposed to do anything that has to do with DEI, and this is supporting minority students, and maybe this would look bad. Maybe we should just cancel this concert. And I was very upset with that. And as since I expressed my unhappiness with this, there was this wonderful piece on 60 Minutes that I hope everyone has had the chance to see. If not, as soon as you're done watching this podcast, please go and find the clip where 60 Minutes wanted to do a story about these students. And they were able to put together a band of not current military musicians, because they're not allowed to perform these things, but they were able to get veterans very, very quickly. And my friend Julie Bowler actually had a large hand in that. because she knew that as soon as you gave, these retired military musicians 5 seconds to hear what was going on, they would all absolutely leap enthusiastically into the position of being able to make music with these people.
Kind of what the situation currently reminds me of is that Europe is playing this animal, that when attacked by an aggressor or a bigger animal, that it just plays dead in hopes that that the predator will just walk away. So if we don't admit that we're under attack, we're just lie on our backs, belly up, not looking pretty. That is our hope, that that Putin just sniffs us and just decides, okay, they're not worth eating because basically they're just dead, and walk the other way. Because for me, I really, really don't understand the whole debate that has been going, and especially now, because if we divide it, okay, so since the war started up until the Trump's election, you might have thought, and we have that discussion in Lithuania as well, that look, I mean, it's extremely costly to have a European defense strategy, really, to change, to imagine the world without the US. I mean, we're talking trillions, literally, like people calculated, it's like, I don't know, 5 trillion euros that need to be invested in order for us to be able to replace the United States here in Europe. So since there was no debate about that, or at least, we could have pretended that there's no debate about that, it was kind of, at least you could have find an explanation why we're there. So we invested, Poles invested more, but the Europe was not moving. So Putin did not wake us up. So now comes Trump, and he says, look, I might be moving out of Europe. And I'm convinced that this will happen in some way or form. And now you have leaders of Europe literally declaring that, look, Europe is a soft power project. We need to think more about our culture and songs and I don't know what, rather than weapons. And to me, there's literally just no explanation other than you guys back at the front, you deal with Putin, and we'll just be fine wherever we are further down south or west. And this is scary because basically it means that the Europe, which we consider it being some sort of a union that takes care of all the countries within, that it might be no more.
Inspiring, not only about because they are spying, but because they are planting disinformation online, which is not as exciting as the other thing, because they are spraying on Austrian walls close to magazines, close to newspapers, close where journalists work, spraying allegedly pro-Ukrainian messages with a far-right symbolism, which is, of course, in Austria and Germany a big deal, makes everybody nervous because of our history, to harm Ukraine, to portray Ukraine or the people who support Ukraine in a far-right way, and to harm and to sabotage the support for Ukraine. And I want to go back to the Cold War for 10 seconds. The Soviet Union back then in the days, they did the same. After the end of World War II, they sprayed swastikas on the walls in Germany to portray Germany as a still Nazi country, to sabotage the process of the good relationships that were built back then between Germany and France, and the start of the European Union. Everything that we have now in Europe goes back to these days of a new friendship where former enemies become friends, and the Soviets tried to sabotage it, and now the Moscovites or the Russians try to sabotage the support for Ukraine.
Understand how so many Americans supported this movement, a leader of Donald Trump and who support this movement in general, without noting the critical role of disinformation. They really declared a war on the truth. Let's just look at a few things that they do. They depend in a really fundamental way on a war on the facts. I mean, one of the first casualties of sort of fact-free hyper-partisanship is competence in government. We can see it in the whole Doge fiasco, right? What kind of government fires the people who handle nuclear weapons? They base policy on lies, on the idea that up is down. So, for example, the administration came to power in part by claiming, what is our greatest problem facing our nation? Is it the fact that so many American children live in poverty, that so many Americans can't afford their homes? Is it that the price of life in the United States is becoming unsustainable, that the number one cause of death among children and adolescents is gun violence? No. They said our biggest problem we face is what they call wokeness, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they use that to launch attacks on free speech, on higher education, on science research, and on civil rights legislation. They manufacture propaganda all the time. They say our public schools are nothing more than Marxist indoctrination factories that exist to change children's gender. This is ridiculous, of course, but they use this lie to justify the dismantling of public education. They say that Democrats want to abort babies after they're born, which isn't a thing. That doesn't happen. That's called infanticide and it's illegal. But they use this lie to restrict various kinds of the most sort of popular and effective forms of birth control, or prevent pregnancy in its very earliest stages. So, above all, I think we can see this is a movement that is waging war on the truth.
So I understand the levers, but I still fell deeply in the rabbit hole and into Russian propaganda and into the darkness of Russian propaganda. And it's a very, very dark and kind of painful world. And in many ways, to kind of go back, you have to go through a lot of self-assessment, which is often very, very painful. It's very, very sad. There's a degree of feeling of like an idiot and feeling kind of stupid and feeling kind of powerless, which in many ways I was at the time. And I think there's a degree of self-loathing. I think it's important this isn't a victim narrative, because the victims are the people of Ukraine, those that have been faced with a genocide, a linguicide, ecocide, and a cultural side, and they're the victims. But I think by speaking out, hopefully we can start learning. I think I'm one of the few people that has spoken out about the journey into Russian propaganda, but hopefully start learning about how we can kind of stop the narratives and what are those point of narratives, and how does it work, and how does it work on the mind. And
as somebody who spent your career really working super hard, super diligently to go after money launderers, financial fraud, as a former IRS criminal investigator, where are you in this? How are you actually feeling when you see what looks to be crimes occurring in plain view that people would have been prosecuted for and
Well,
possibly imprisoned for when it comes to
I,
the highest office in our country?
how do I feel? I'm saddened when I see this. There's so many potential issues of corruption and implying of influence and the possibility that a close circle of economic advisors tied to the White House may well have benefited from inside knowledge with regard to the imposition of the tariffs, one, and two, the rescission or the decrease in the tariffs and the impact that had on the stock market.